Hi, I'm Dr. Valerie Leyva. I'm a clinical supervisor for Stanislaus County, and I provide a number of trainings for them as well. This is the intern and new associate training session. We're talking about stuff that you don't necessarily get in class or things that we really need to reinforce for the county. Today, we're going to talk about law and ethics and how to deal with personal values issues and how to make decisions. So let me start to share and get into our PowerPoint and get back to the beginning. So this is about legal and ethical decision making, which we all have to do as new associates, whether you're a social worker, an LPCC, or an MFT. So the learning objectives for today are to develop a method for making and documenting legal and ethical decisions in clinical and case management settings rather. I'm sure you've heard the adage that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So it's really important to document not only what you did, but how you came to your decision in some of these situations. Also, today we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between ethics and risk management. They're both very important, but they're very different. And so they have different decision-making sequences. So let's look at a review. I think most of you have had this in class at some point. Laws, ethics, and values are different. Laws are the written and voted on by public or the legislature. They're followed by everyone. There is some type of enforcement. When we work in public mental health, we frequently have issues around ethics and values embedded in these laws. There's rules and regulations with penalties attached, and laws are meant to maintain the social order. Laws, however, are not always ethical. Think of wherever you live and the news you hear, and in different states make different decisions about a lot of the issues that affect us in the mental health world, and we don't always agree with them and don't always see them as ethical. So just be aware that laws are not necessarily ethical, but they're agreed on by the general public or the state or national or local legislature. Ethics are a little bit different. They're principles that guide behavior. This really deals with right and wrong from an ethical and a philosophical perspective. So it helps all of us learn how to act in different situations and really helps us address issues of, do I have to make this decision or do I have to make that decision? So laws guide us, ethics guides us, which is why we all have a code of ethics we have to follow. And then we have values, and values are embedded in our codes of ethics, and sometimes they're explicit. I know they are in the ACA Code of Ethics and the NASW Code of Ethics. I haven't looked at LMFT in a while, so I need to take a look at the AAMFT Codes of Ethics to see what their values are. But values are culturally held beliefs, so it's embodiment of what an organization stands for. So I know one of the values in social work is dignity and worth of the person. So we treat all people with dignity, whether or not we like them, whether or not they smell good, whether or not they're housed, whether or not they speak the language we do. So it's really important to treat everybody the same, meaning everybody gets treated with dignity and worth. So just for a minute, talk about the difference between ethics and risk management. So ethics helps people make decisions that create positive impacts and avoid unjust outcomes. So ethics, again, value laden. It's about the individual and doing what's right for the individual that you're working with. Risk management is a little different, although at BHRS we have to consider both because we're a governmental organization and we have mandates about how to run our organization. So risk management helps organizations minimize financial loss. It protects their reputation and ensures the safety of their employees and stakeholders. So for instance, I'm always going to tell you as a supervisor, your safety is paramount. That's a risk management issue because I don't want you unsafe. I want you to be safe in your environment. I want you to be protected. I want the county's reputation to be protected because I'm a county contractor. It certainly is going to minimize financial risk. We don't want you to get hurt because that also is going to cost money through workers' compensation or insurance. So we hit all three of those in risk management. For me, your safety is also an ethical issue. I want what's best for you, and I want to make the right and just decision on your behalf. So I don't want you to expose yourself to unsafe situations or unsafe members or anything like that. So think about ethics and risk management. There's some overlap there, but they each have different outcomes and they each have different directions that they are concerned with. So, we're going to talk today about ethics in terms of ethical dilemmas and identifying what the ethical dilemma is. So, ethical dilemmas come in the form of clients or members. They come in the form of us practitioners. They come from the organization, the agency, BHRS. They come from Stanislaus County. They can come from the community, all of the community partners we have and stakeholders we have. It can come from the profession. Does this action line up with my code of ethics or not? And then society also presents us with ethical dilemmas. And for me, this is the thing that's more obvious to me is in politics. When we have politics, every 2 to 4 years, we might elect a mayor, a governor, or a legislator or president. And maybe that party has their values based in a certain set of ideals. And maybe 2 years later, you elect somebody else whose values are embedded in a different set of ideals. And that can provide us with a lot of ethical dilemmas in terms of what access do clients have to resources, what are we going to do about the situation, et cetera. So just be mindful that, golly, ethical dilemmas can come everywhere from a client interaction you have to the much larger societal issues that we have today. So an ethical dilemma is usually around a conflict. Is the conflict around problem definition? Is it around what are we treating the person for? Is it around goal setting? Whose goals are paramount? The clients, the organizations, the societies? We also have ethical dilemmas based on priorities. What do I help this member with first? Right. So, but yet there's this other thing here that's really important that I have to pay attention to. So how do I know which one to act on first? We can have conflicts in our decisions about strategy. I think this treatment modality would be better. My supervisor thinks this treatment modality would be better. Which one? How do I choose? What do I choose? There's conflicts in desired outcomes. You might have a desired outcome for your client. Your client may have a completely different desired outcome. And so in our work with clients, we know that clients' goals and outcomes and desires are primary. But what if it's a real ethical dilemma for you? What if it isn't necessarily going to value life or value the dignity of the person? So that can be an ethical dilemma. And then evaluation and reporting about evaluations can be ethical dilemmas. What happens when you write a report from this perspective? You can also write the report from another perspective, depending on the kind of outcome you want. And you've got to figure out how are you going to find your middle road where you're consistent with your code of ethics, with your county requirements, with California and federal laws. So these are where we see ethical dilemmas arise. So everybody involved is going to have different assumptions regarding values. The client or member that you're seeing, your supervisor, your professional organization, your licensing board, everybody has a piece of the values. California law, values are embedded in law as well. Everybody may have different assumptions regarding issues. What is the issue here? What is the difficulty that we're seeing, and why am I having an ethical problem making a decision on which way to go? There's going to be different assumptions regarding system levels. So is this an individual level intervention I need to make? Is it a family level, a community level, an organizational level? So looking at those levels of practice are really important to know and to be able to talk about. And then everybody involved everywhere has different assumptions and opinions on human nature. What is human nature? How do we understand it from a psychological perspective? How do we understand it from a developmental perspective? How do we understand it from a social worker community perspective? So everybody's going to have different assumptions on this around something as seemingly simple as who is my client? Is your client the person whose name is on the chart? Is it their family system? Is it that member and their siblings? So it's really important to even take these simple theming decisions and think them through to be clear that you're operating in an ethical manner. So a group of social workers, I'm a social worker, so I take most of my resources from social work, developed a really good model for ethical decision making. And there are three steps to it. One is called the ethical rule screen, which we'll look at next. How do I use my code of ethics to make ethical decisions? Then there's the code of ethics, and the social work, the MFT, and the LPCC codes of ethics are very different. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And then they've developed an ethical principles screen for you to use if your code of ethics isn't clear. And down here is the link, not a link, but a citation for the really good book on making ethical decisions. So this is the ethical rules screen. So your first step is to start at the top of the pyramid and examine the code of ethics to determine if any of the code rules are applicable. These rules take precedent over all of our personal value systems. When we decide to step into these professions, we don't just set our values and ethics aside because we're not a blank screen. There's no such thing in this kind of work as a blank screen. But you recognize that your values may differ from your consumer or the member, and your ethics may differ from your consumer and your member. And for me, one of the decisions that helped me make this was to say, I've got my life and the client, the consumer, and the member has their life. And I'm living my life by my values, which includes being a professional social worker, which includes following my codes of ethics. And the client may have a completely different orientation to values, ethics, and how they're going to live their life. So it's not about me. It's about the consumer, the member, the client. And I always follow my code of ethics, California law, and my agency's protocols for working with consumers and members. So, first thing to do is look at your code of ethics. I tell you what, the social work code of ethics is pretty general because mental health is only one small sector of social work. There's child welfare, there's grant writing, there's running agencies, there's a lot of other things that social workers do. So, our code of ethics is relatively short compared to the American Counseling Association code of ethics, which is the one used by LPCCs, which is about 3 times longer than the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, because LPCCs and MFTs, they use the AAMFT Code of Ethics, the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, their Code of Ethics is equally long as the ACA, because our colleagues in those professions or those professional communities mostly do counseling and mental health counseling. So their code of ethics can be much more specific than the social work code of ethics is. So sometimes when I look up stuff in my NASW code of ethics, I think, oh man, that is not helpful because that's really vague. Sometimes I'll look at the ACA code of ethics or the AAMFT code of ethics in order to determine, are there other value systems? Are there other ways of considering this ethical dilemma? In terms of documentation, when you have to document decision making for an ethical dilemma, you write in your progress notes or somewhere in your report. Looked at the NASW Code of Ethics, did not have specific information. Also looked at ACA and AAMFT Code of Ethics. Theirs recommends step 1, step 2, step 3. So you're documenting your thought process and the resources that you've used when you have need to look at an ethical dilemma. And honestly, that will help you very much if you are unfortunate enough to be involved in a malpractice case or a or any case regarding your actions or decisions as a social worker, because the person who's doing the arbitration or the mediation or the judge will look at, what documents did you use? Did you just sit in your office and kind of think it through? Or did you look at documents that regulate and advise our professions? And the other thing you would be advised to look at is California law. But laws are different than ethics, and we're just talking about ethics today. So here are some links to your code of ethics. NASW is here. It's a pretty permanent link. AAMFT is here, and ACA for associate LPCCs, as well as their value statements. They just published it in a different document. I'd really like you to keep these links somewhere so that you can access them easily, because when you need to make decisions about an ethical dilemma, I don't want you spending a lot of time looking up documents. I want you to be able to access them as fast as you can. So let's say your ethical dilemma with a consumer didn't your code of ethics didn't tell you anything about what to do. So if your code of ethics is not specific enough or doesn't address the issue, and one of the ways in which codes of ethics are having to catch up are issues around technology and social media and how we do families these days, because it's pretty different than it was even 20 years ago. You got to take a different perspective. So here is the ethical principles screen. So this is a set of ethical principles generally agreed upon by most professions um, in Western democracies, not just English speaking countries, but also Europe and South America, um, North America, Australia, Asia, and Africa, and many of those countries. This is the list that we go by. And the most important thing is number one on the top of the pyramid, and that is protection of life. So if you were in an ethical dilemma, where issues include maybe quality of life for the person and privacy and confidentiality, and there's a risk of loss of life, you really have to address the first ethical principle first, which is protection of life. So this is why we have the Tarasoff laws around mandated reporting regarding homicide, homicidal intention. Also, the other set of laws that regulate how we report suicide, suicidality, and suicide intention, as well as our laws about gravely disabled. So those are encompassed in California under the 5150 codes for the most part. I'm not sure where Tarasoff is, but I know gravely disabled and suicidality and homicidality are all codified under 5150 laws. So you have to act on that first. So if you've got issues around the consumer, the member's quality of life, well, quality of life isn't going to be really important if they're not alive. So you've got to address protection of life. And in California law, we are allowed to breach confidentiality to report suicidal, homicidal ideations and somebody who's gravely disabled. So you can see where these different issues come in at different levels of importance in looking at an ethical principle screen. So the second most important is equality and inequality. This is really important and close to my heart as a social worker because so much of what we work on in social work is access to resources. Is everybody getting access to what they need? This is equity rather than equality. Equality means everybody gets the same thing, and that's really important as a public employee to make sure that we treat every client the same, that we give them access to all the services they're entitled to, and that we have sort of a standard way in which we present ourselves, in which we interact with others, regardless of who the other person is, their income, their language they speak, their ethnic or cultural identity. None of that matters. We have to treat people the same and we have to treat people equally. And that's what principle number two is about. Principle number three is about autonomy and freedom. Will our ethical decision impinge on the person's autonomy and freedom? And you notice that that's lower than protection of life because we do suspend somebody's civil rights when we 5150 them, because for 48 hours, they're obligated to stay in a locked facility in order to protect them from harm and protect them from ending their life. So autonomy and freedom is a little bit down the scale than protection of life. Number four is least harm, meaning that we choose with our consumer or member interventions that provide them with the least harm and the most good. So many of you have heard about the Hippocratic oath for doctors take and nurses take a similar oath. We don't take that oath, but we do make sure that we do no harm to our consumers and to our communities as well. So least harm is really important, but again, it's underneath autonomy and freedom. If somebody has the freedom to do something in their community maybe we don't agree with, well, we can talk to them about least harm and harm reduction as a technique that we use, but they still have the autonomy and freedom to engage in behaviors that they wish to engage in, even if it might be harmful to them, as long as it's not a life-threatening situation. Number five is quality of life. I don't know about you, but for me, quality of life is really high on my personal list. And I certainly have the status and the income and the means to maintain a quality of life that's important to me. But when we look at clients and consumers and members, quality of life actually goes underneath least harm, goes under harm reduction. So I also think a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, also a pyramid, and the basic needs, you start on the bottom there, the basic needs of safety, shelter, food, and clothing comes before you get to quality of life. So again, interesting to see that this is as low on the pyramid as possible. My goodness, here's privacy and confidentiality. We talk to you all the time about privacy and confidentiality because of California law and agency regulations. However, from an ethics perspective, privacy and confidentiality is lower On the pyramid, then obviously protection of life or autonomy and freedom. So this is the ethical principle that led to the laws in most states where we can breach confidentiality to report homicidal and suicidal ideation in gravely disabled situations. And at the bottom, truthfulness and full disclosure. Again, honesty is a really high value for me, but from an ethical perspective, it gets trumped by all of these other issues. So don't mistake this by saying, oh, I don't have to be truthful or I don't have to disclose. You got to be crystal clear, transparent with clients, unless it's going to impinge on their autonomy and freedom, protection of life, privacy and confidentiality. I have a policy of always being clear with people, with supervisees, with colleagues, with clients, and I try to be as transparent as possible. But there might be a situation in when truthfulness and full disclosure might be harmful to a client. Think about reporting child abuse. Are you going to call the parent first to let them know you're going to call CPS? You're going to call CPS first, right? So that's where this value or ethical issue comes in. So that's a lot of information. So what we're going to do is kind of break it down for each case study. We've got 2 case studies today. What are the ethical dilemmas in each scenario is the first question. Use your code of ethics, the ethical rules screen, and the ethical principles screen to work through each scenario. And how would you have handled the situation differently? So let's look at scenario number 1. So Maria is a new social worker at a local full service partnership. Through the grapevine, she heard that Dr. Sidhu spoke about her client's father, about the client's diagnosis and treatment at the local gym. So the doctor allegedly and the father were at the local gym, and the doctor was talking to the father about his son's treatment, even though Maria knew that her client did not sign consent for his family to receive any information about his hospital stay or treatment. So that's your setup. Maria became enraged, calling Dr. Sidhu a towelhead with his turban wrapped too tight. Ouch. Maria left the team meeting and reported Dr. Sidhu to the agency director and to the patient advocate. Later that same afternoon, Maria's supervisor called her into her office to discuss what happened and to talk about the comments made about Dr. Sidhu. So let's go back to the previous screen. What are the ethical dilemmas in this scenario? What does your code of ethics say about your obligation to colleagues? What does your code of ethics say about information you receive? How do you handle information? What does your code of ethics say about supervision? These are some places you might look. So let's go back 2 screens to your code of ethics, look it up, see if there's any information. If there's no information that's helpful to you, come down to the ethical principles screen and take a look at that. So I'm going to stop for a minute and give you some time to do this on your own. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about what are some of the issues in this case study. So coming back to case study number 1 with Maria, hearing some gossip about the physician she worked with and a client's father. She called Dr. Sidhu pretty serious racial ethnic slur, and she reported the doctor to the agency director and the patient advocate. And her supervisor said, let's have a meeting this afternoon to process some of this. So what are the ethical dilemmas here? For me, these are the big 4 that are here. Number 1, the associate is responding to gossip. This is essentially gossip. When you hear anything through the grapevine, it's gossip. It may be true, it may not be true. So you always have to verify what others tell you before you act on it. The second ethical dilemma was she engages in using ethnic slurs. This comes under your code of ethics on your relationship with colleagues or your responsibility to colleagues, which is to treat them with dignity and respect. This is a significant violation of professional ethical standards, and it's a violation of Stan County HR regulations. Absolutely do not engage, number 1, in gossip, and number 2, there's no place in the workplace for name calling. And if you hear somebody name calling, there's a lot of research about how to interrupt that person. And then if the person continues to engage in it, you talk to your supervisor about it. So don't permit or allow name calling of any kind in the workplace. The third ethical dilemma was the associate does not follow the chain of command in reporting her concerns. Now, I didn't see this in most code of ethics, so let me go back to the principal screen. Well, she didn't use her chain of command. I'm not sure where it would land here. Is it truthfulness and full disclosure, privacy and confidentiality, quality of life, least harm? I think it sits in here somewhere. Different folks might have different perspectives of this, but at least it's going to give you a place to hang your hat in terms of what you're concerned about with this ethical dilemma. So I'm going to go back to the screen with ethical dilemmas. The associate does not consult her direct supervisor. Always process issues and concerns with your direct supervisor. This is partly what supervision is for, to help guide you as you're learning and becoming a member of this profession about how to handle these situations. Because working with people's lives and people's personal information is complex, it is tiring. There are some legal issues involved with it. It can be stressful. And so your supervisor is there to help you pick apart what is it that we're dealing with here? What was the problem in this big old ethical dilemma? Well, the problem was that Maria was concerned about her client's confidentiality. That's it. Was the client's confidentiality breached in an inappropriate way? That should be what you take to supervision. Hey, I heard this, but I can't verify it. And here's the other thing I get a lot, and I don't want to say who told me. But here's the issue. And so your supervisor will process that with you with the particular details regarding your particular situation in the organization. And there is a chain of command for asking people who rank above you in the chain of command, did this happen? Who saw it? Usually when I have an issue with somebody, I talk to them directly, but I recognize an associate is not going to ask a psychiatrist, hey, did you talk about my client's information? A breach of HIPAA and confidentiality and a few other things at the gym with the client's dad. So I know that's not going to happen. So that's also why your supervisor is there to see if there are other ways you can respond to this and what is the most appropriate way for you to respond to this in your work setting. So let's look at case study number 2. Nina is a 17-year-old female in her final semester of high school. She's been sexually active since the age of 14 and has had more than 6 partners. Nina takes birth control pills but does not like the feel of a condom. Thus, oral contraception is her only line of defense, which is not 100% effective, and neither are condoms. Usually use, if you really don't want to get pregnant, use 2 methods together. That's more effective. She's been dating a guy named Jimmy, age 22, for 3 months and discovers she is pregnant. And she's been infected with chlamydia, which is a treatable and curable STD. Nina is considering not telling Jimmy about the pregnancy and having an abortion. Well, there are a lot of ethical issues here. There's a lot of values issues in here. So, what is the ethical dilemma in here? So that's what my screen talks about, is not ethical dilemmas in terms of what goes on in terms of processing in an agency, but this is an ethical and values dilemma for the worker in many situations. So we've got a lot of questions. So the first one is this sexual abuse in California between a 17-year-old minor and a 22-year-old adult? So this is not necessarily a mandated report. It's called clinical judgment. And the things to consider in whether or not you're going to report this for investigation is whether or not this relationship is consensual and whether the youth is being exploited in some way or coerced in some way. And right underneath this is the link for the California law, that grid that tells you how old the youth is and how old the other person is. And you go down, is this a mandated report or is this clinical judgment? So it's a useful tool. So in this situation, it's not mandated, but I would have that conversation with the youth to determine how she's being treated in the relationship and does she have freedom within that relationship. Second question a lot of folks have, and I had too, it took me a while to find the law on this. Am I a mandated reporter for STDs in California? The answer is no. LCSWs, LMFTs, LPCCs, and the associates are not mandated reporters for STDs, and you are required to keep this info confidential as you would any other piece of medical information. However, your duty, and I think it's your ethical duty, is to refer the client to appropriate medical care. Um, as I would if she had diabetes or she was having complications with the pregnancy or she had an addiction issue. Always refer somebody to the appropriate care. However, the client, I need to fix my spelling here, the client herself is legally responsible for telling her partner she has an STD. And I would advise her of that and show her the law. So here, the first link is are we as mental health providers mandated reporters for STDs? The answer is no. However, you're in a work environment with people who are required. It's MDs and the nurse practitioners are required to report STDs to the health department. So just know that your role and the role of other people, of your colleagues in your work environment may be different. The second link is about the client's legal responsibility for telling her partner she has an STD. And this is related to the do no harm laws that we have. Tara's office related to this. Reporting STDs and communicable diseases like this are the responsibility of the individual to report. My third question was, golly, can a 17-year-old obtain an abortion without parental consent in California? And I knew that answer was yes. But can they get one without partner consent? And the answer is yes. A minor doesn't have to have anybody's consent to obtain an abortion in California. This is also true in Nevada, but it absolutely is not true in Arizona. So just be careful about what part of the state you're working in. If you're working close to a state line, I didn't look up Oregon. So if you work in the far north of California, you might want to look that up. And here is the link to that information. And I dropped my number 4 here. How do I manage my personal values about her age, her level of sexual activity, and her intent about abortion, etc.? So here is where a lot of associates come in with, oh my God, I have all these feelings about this. I think this is right and this is wrong. Or I think this is right and that's wrong. Now remember, ethics is about right or wrong. It also has values embedded in it. Laws are also about right and wrong. They also have values embedded in them. And depending on the work setting that you're in, meaning what state you work in, because many of you may leave the state of California at some point, you've really got to be clear. Is this my issue with what the client's doing, or is this the client's issue or the client's dilemma? And when it's the client's dilemma, and I realize that I've got all these feelings about it, you follow your code of ethics, obviously, about client self-determination. Client has the legal right to make all these decisions, let alone these ethical decisions. California law also informs you. And then again, supervision, both individual and group supervision. You got to process your feelings, your concerns, your values, your stressors, et cetera, in supervision. Um, I remember a situation where in California, abortion is legal until the fetus is viable as determined by the medical provider. This is kind of every decade or so, we scooch that back another week or two. And I worked a number of years ago, I did group supervision at Sierra Vista, and somebody had a client who was almost at that viability point. I mean, she was obviously pregnant. Is the associate said, I know there's a baby in there. And that was her feeling. And honestly, that was everybody's feeling in the group, including mine. And the client stated she was getting the abortion to get back at the baby's father. All of us were kind of destroyed by that decision. But you know what? Not my life. Client has a legal and ethical right to make that decision, no matter how I feel about it or how any of us felt about it. So we use that group supervision and a couple more to kind of process our feelings about it. I'm actually getting a little tearful now talking about it because it's so against my values. But again, that's my values in my life about my body and my decision-making process if I was in that situation. Client absolutely has the right to make those decisions for herself. So just remember that clients are not going to make decisions and they're going to get into ethical dilemmas and they're going to engage in behaviors that we do not agree with. And supervision is the place to process it. The code of ethics is where you first look to figure out what am I even talking about here in terms of what's the dilemma? Figure out who's got the dilemma. Is it you, the client, the organization, another family member, a stakeholder, a community agency? And use the ethical principle screen if your code of ethics does not give you information about what direction you should take. So I hope you've learned from this webinar, please do come back and look at this again. Please look up the links and keep those links for yourself so that you have them ready. And I even print out the ethical principles screen and have it in my supervision notebook so I can always refer to it, along with the how many hours do you need for your licensing exam. So there's lots of things to consider with ethical decision making, and it's really important to know your code of ethics, your local laws, state laws, federal laws, and your agency's protocol. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.